Hi, my name is Lori Trevino, and this is my Ecological Integration Symposium report. The first presentation that I saw was Canopy Frogs of Gabon by Ed Basham, and I believe he was a researcher, though he never specifically stated it. The main question of the presentation was about the diversity and distribution of the amphibians and reptiles in Gabon's canopy forests. Some of the factors investigated include species richness, physical attributes in regards to habitat preference, and vertical distribution within the forest canopy. In order to collect the data, scientists had to ascend the trees using a rope cannon to secure their rope on a branch. Then they put on their harness and climbed up as high as they could to vertically survey the canopy. They conducted vertical transects to record as many frogs and reptiles as they could find within an hour, and they did this during the night and day. Despite the small forest size, results showed a surprising diversity of amphibians and reptiles in the canopy forest of Gabon, with reptiles primarily found higher up in the trees and various frog species occupying different niches within the habitat. During this process, they even found a new species of Bufus tree frogs, though it is not officially recognized due to unfiled paperwork. In regards to connecting the presentation to what we have learned in class, he mentioned that the frogs were very difficult to find because they have adapted through natural selection to be able to camouflage with their environment. There was an incredible diversity with skin texture and coloration amongst ground frogs, and this all depended on where they spent most of their time, whether it be in the tree cracks or among the leafy and muddy forest floor. These attributes aided in their ability to camouflage and avoid predators in their specific environment. So, frogs that stood out against their background most likely were the ones that died due to natural selection, leaving the ones who were better at blending in alive. What I found surprising were the different techniques he used to find the species. For instance, there was a gecko that looked like a leaf, and they only found it when it was actively hunting at night because that's the only time it was really moving, so they could see it. And they found a chameleon smaller than your thumb pad that was almost impossible to spot during the day. But at night, they shined a light on it, and the chameleon would light up, which I found really interesting. The second presentation that I saw was the effects of range management on the plateau spot-tailed earless lizard. And this was the second year results out of a 3-year study. This was by Catherine Steffen, and she was a graduate student. The main question for this presentation was to determine the habitat preferences of a lizard species and to see which range management practices aimed at combating juniper encroachment, which is a plant that is native to Texas, but it's very, very invasive in regards to the habitat. But it was to see which was most preferable and comfortable for the lizards, which range management practice was. The primary methods used included mark recapture studies, individual tracking, habitat measurements, and remote sensing for habitat classification. To capture the lizards, they used a pole with a noose on the end to somewhat lasso and catch the lizards so that they could grab them. This did not hurt the lizards, though, since they were so light. Often, scientists would form a circle and walk inwards in an attempt to bottleneck any lizards towards the middle, which I thought was a very clever way to catch them. For the results, it indicated that grazing was the most preferred habitat for the lizards. This was followed by burned areas, and the combination of burn and graze showed mixed results. So it is believed that the lizards preferred when there was just grazing, which I think was a great coalition of having the goats and allowed them to work together in order to create the best habitat. Overall, this presentation was very informative and thorough, and it allowed me to appreciate the effects of eco-friendly habitat management as opposed to methods that may be more harmful to the lizard population, such as completely eradicating juniper encroachment. To relate this to what we've learned in class, this study examines how habitat preferences of the plaid-toed spot-tailed earless lizard are influenced by range management practices in regards to juniper encroachment. This relates to the fundamental concept of habitat selection and the ways in which organisms respond to changes in their environment. Additionally, the uses of grazing animals like goats and sheep as a management strategy illustrates the concept of species interaction, where the behavior of one species, the grazing animals, directly affects the habitat and resources available to another species, the lizards. And lastly, the results of this study showed that the combination of burning and grazing was too disruptive for the lizards, indicating that their sensitivity to habitat disturbance was high. This aligns with the principles of disturbance ecology, which examines how disturbances such as fire or grazing can impact ecosystem structure and function. And the last presentation that I saw was called Why Are There So Many Darters in East Texas Streams by Jordan Lindholm, who I believe was a researcher. All right, so the main question of this presentation was to understand why there is a high abundance of darters, which are a type of fish, in East Texas streams, while also exploring the local environmental predictors of darter diversity and their conservation status. So basically, which environmental factors, such as cloudiness or different materials of the bottom layer of the water, allowed for better populations. The primary method used include standardized surveys of 30 sites per basin, assessing environmental factors like substrate, water flow, and depth, and collecting fish using backpack, electrofishing, and seine hauls. The results and conclusions state that they gathered a total of 563 fish from 10 different species, 5 of which were exclusively located in the Neches River, including the gumbo darter, identified as a species requiring significant conservation efforts. The results showed greater darter richness in the Neches River compared to the Sabine River, with substrate composition, water discharge, depth, and turbidity influencing darter populations. Something that I found interesting were the methods of fish collection. There were 2 main methods employed to collect fish specimens for analysis. The first method involved backpack electrofishing. Basically, an electrical current is used to temporarily stun the fish, and this allowed the researchers to capture them for examination. The second method utilized seine hauls, which basically just drags a net through the water to capture all the fish. I believe that the second method would be most useful, but it was never specifically stated which one worked better. And to relate this to what we have learned in class, this study reminds me of the common garden experiment we most recently talked about. In a common garden study, individuals from different populations are raised in a common garden to assess genetic and environmental influences on traits. Similarly, in this study, fish from different populations in the Neches and Sabine river basins were collected and examined to understand their distribution and abundance in response to environmental factors. But this study isn't exactly a common garden study because it looks at how the environment affects fish populations instead of focusing on which genetic traits thrive in different environments. Also, instead of raising fish in a controlled environment, they study them in their natural habitats. But I do believe that they all have the same backbone, and this was just something I noticed and remembered. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation and thought that I added some useful points and added some intellectual contribution and analysis to these amazing presentations that I saw. It was very interesting, and I hope to go again next year. Thank you for listening.